Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics Beyond the Book. This is a show that breaks down the fundamental concepts behind tabletop games and how they're played. I'm your host, Troy. Joining me today is my co-host, as always, Max. And with us behind the scenes is our producer, Jay. Today's episode is about gameplay and campaign aids. So today we dive into the unsung heroes of tabletop wargaming and RPGs, the tools, trackers, aids that bring clarity, immersion, and momentum to our games. So these are a range of objects, typically objects.
Yeah, I mean, they are sometimes software, more increasingly so. But if you're playing a tabletop game, evidently you're going to need some kind of, well, you don't need it, but it's a lot easier than remembering, unit conditions, and even dice, I suppose, count as an aid, though I would consider it to be essential, so we can kind of gloss over that.
But spare dice for sure would qualify as some type of aid. Like the number of times I've used dice to stand in for tokens in a war game that had, we'll say, a laundry list of statuses, right? I would just know that a red dice set to a 3 is this list, this entry. And I didn't have a token for it, but I knew that's what a red 3 was, right? But a red 2 was a different one, meant a different token. So I kind of like...
So I have a similar feeling about that. And I usually like to use very small, I guess, 10 millimeter dice. They might even be smaller than that. But yeah, the smallest sort of standard size of dice as a way of tracking like numerical values.
Yes.
And this is not uncommon. Lots of people do this. But I always find that like games that make you track things like wounds with individual little markers, I don't understand why people have the patience for that. I think I've mentioned this before, but like, yeah, using a little die, especially if you're playing a game that only counts up to 12 on any particular thing. So like in Chain, there's shock and stuff like that. And usually you're not counting up higher than what would be shown on 2 dice. But in addition to that, I went out onto Amazon and I found a little package of tiny colored wooden cubes. And I think they're meant for like board games, like German board games like Power Grid and other sorts of things where you just need, and it's literally just a collection of random cubes. But what I'll do is before the game starts as prep, I'll make a note as to what the colors mean for those things. And it's just so much more convenient. It's got a couple things that I consider to be really convenient about it. One, they're really small. Like they're actually smaller than my smallest dice.
Yeah, they're like 6 millimeter ish.
Yeah, they're brightly colored, which is nice because you don't lose them. I mean, there's a few grays, and the gray ones don't work so good. But most of them are like yellow, orange, pink, white, blue. And you usually don't need a ton of these, but you list them out, the sort of conditions. You make a short little recipe card or whatever, and you just say what each color means. If you're feeling fancy, you can actually write it in the color that it is. And the other nice thing about it is it had this 3-dimensionality about it so that you don't have to like futz on the table by trying to like pick up this flat thing, which depending on what surface you're playing on might not be an issue. But I always find flat tokens to be kind of frustrating to use. What do you think? Like, I've seen you play like games that use like individual tokens, and I was like,
yeah, that was Warcry, right? Like Warcry had like so many wound tokens you would be putting down. And it's like, we had fun. It was a fun, like, let's have our dudes murder our dudes. Yeah. Like it's great for that. But it's very bitsy in its token management to the point that like you're moving tokens to move guys because there's just too many tokens, There's too much stuff on the board. Like what I do personally is I used to play Star Wars Legion a lot. It's now in a 2nd edition and it's doing whatever it's doing. I haven't really kept up with it, but I have all these really high quality board game quality components from when Fantasy Flight Games was making them. And I just use those as my generic tokens now for a wide range of games because they have like a yellow caution, a red wound, a green this or green that, even a 3rd green. Like so it's like, oh, I just assign their role. Before I determined I was I had those and was like, oh, I already have these. Why am I not using these? I was going to do exactly what you did and just get the board game cubes. That's the other like really efficient way. I've seen a lot of people in the Two Fat Lardy community. I've seen a lot of people who play some of the more like complicated conflict sim style hex and counter games, adopt those to place on counters to remember different states that are like things that happen in the game that are not like a specific like, oh, he took damage, but you know what I mean? Like, oh, I've already moved this guy, or I moved this guy highway move. So I need to know he moved highway move. So I put a yellow marker on him, you know, especially for like solo gamers, that stuff can be clutch.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the thing though, is if you're playing a solo game, you have the patience of one person.
It's true.
And the framing of that is different, right? Like, I actually think that heavier mechanical games work better as solo games because you can put up with as much as you can put up with. Nobody's waiting to take their turn. Well, I'll put it that way.
That's really true. But in contrast, you don't have two brains. So it's harder to sometimes suss out everything that you're supposed to be aware of. Like there can be moments where it's like, oh, I'm doing this and I forgot that. Like we were playing Chain of Command 2 last night, and I was playing with my primary opponent, Darren. And when I was shooting at one of his JOPs, one of his jump off markers with suppression fire, we were like, remember the new rule about that. You know, we had to remember what that now meant.
Right.
Because it can limit your deployment if you start applying suppressive fire on a jump off marker before someone deploys to it. It's kind of like it's getting pregame bombarded now.
Mm-hmm.
So but we had to remember that I was doing that because there's so much other things happening. And it was kind of like, it's nice to have another brain in the mix for that. But I do appreciate what you mean. You have the patience of someone else that like waiting for their turn, their action. And you don't want to have to do a million steps to resolve your fuel expenditure as you race across Tunisia, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's nice when games kind of recognize the usability. And sometimes it's the community that does this.
Yeah.
Like Battletech movement dice. Is that like a FASA thing? I haven't even bothered to look that up.
I don't know who is the origin point of that. I just know that they are beloved, not essential, because you can use, again, colored D6.
You can use regular dice if you don't mind kind of cross-referencing or memorizing.
But they're so handy, like having the state with the TMM and then the color coding for whether you were moving at different rates of speed or jumping, right? Like that's really valuable. And that's the thing I find in games that have lots of states or games that are built around the concept of going through tiers or steps. Tokens are going to be a part of your life. And it's good to think about that and manage that efficiently as opposed to just like using quarters and scraps of paper, because one, that'll be a mess, and two, it's hard to keep that organized in its own way.
Well, mentally too, right? Because you've got to
exactly.
I think it's fine if it's a game you're familiar with.
Yep.
But I always appreciate, like as I said, with like the movement dice in BattleTech, I appreciate the thought that that's a really efficient way to track something and not lay down a whole bunch of stuff on the table.
Yeah, 100%. It does. It's doing the job and doing it with the least amount of real estate, which is kind of the battle in a miniatures game, even though BattleTech can be played on hex predominantly, right? So the aesthetic quality is not as, you're not losing so much per se, right? But there is that tension in a miniature war game on more of a dioramic layout for you to not clutter it with stuff, to make it look more like something you might come across in some battlefield museum somewhere, right? It's, but there's the reality that you're going to use markers and tokens. So let's think about the ones that are probably most efficient and the least messy, so to speak.
I mean, ultimately, it's a game, right? So it's not a diorama, and you're going to have to keep track of some of these things. And I know that there's sometimes, I mean, maybe you know this better than I do because you have more experience with war games generally, but I know that sometimes there's like tracking sheets for certain things. I mean, again, BattleTech does this. It's certainly classic. I mentioned this before we started the episode, but what we're talking about is basically user interface for something that is an analog game.
You're absolutely right.
And there's a lot of ways to feel that out. And it's like, well, what works? Like what is too much? Is me having to mark down stuff on my sheet And it's funny when you see the strategies, because there's BattleTech is such a good example for this because it uses a lot of, it has a particular kind of crunch to it that has a lot of things to track. And you're familiar with zigzagging is in BattleTech?
No.
So you know how you have hit points on your arms and legs?
Yeah.
So rather than poking them out with a dot, you just start drawing a line through them and it looks like a zigzag.
Oh, yes. Okay, so totally. That's practically what I'm doing. I just don't know that it's called that.
Yeah, I don't know that everybody calls it that, but certainly the people that I play with or the people at the club that I go to those games, when asked, it was like, yeah, you just zigzag out the points.
That's hilarious. I can picture it. Okay, great. Well, see, it's funny, like in a lot of, let's call them terrestrial war games where your boots are in the mud, there's not a lot of tracking sheets, but if you look at naval war games, there you go. There are your tracking sheets for days where you have one for every escort vessel practically, right? So there's a lot of examples of different ways to track information, even just across, like, I guess we'll refer to them as genres of play in a war game. Like, I don't mind the presence of tokens on the table because I think they serve a very specific and purposeful job. But you could also use dry erase unit cards or like rosters where you track similar information. You know what I mean?
Sure. But okay, so then there's another point that comes to the whole tracking is unit distinguishment.
Yeah.
How do you remember what unit is tracked by what card? Unless, of course, like, so one way you could do this is you could take a token that just has a number and embed that in the unit or put it next to it. Skirmish games don't have as big of an issue with this because each unit is distinctly different. And as we've mentioned, like BattleTech is a skirmish game, essentially.
Yeah, robot skirmish, but big scale skirmish, but you got it.
It's scaled weird so that it doesn't feel like that's what's going on. But yeah, very often it's a 4-on-4, a 5-on-5, sometimes something more complicated. Sometimes you're using a lot of units. And if you use way too many units, there's a whole separate game for that.
Yes.
There's this idea of economizing and identifying the different parts of what's happening while you're playing. And if you're playing something that uses like a 15 mil war game, unless you're embedding one of those markers and then tracking it separately, and it feels like when you move to that scale of a game, it adds a lot of extra steps.
It certainly can, especially if you're tracking like 12 battalions and you got to know which one's which one. And then you got to look at the roster and then identify like, okay, that's the 11th battalion of my brigade, or not one brigade, but you know what I mean? And then you look at that and you're like, wow, that's crazy. Okay. And then you can reference what's happening on the table state. You can't just look at the table and understand the state right away. And that's the thing. Like, I think rosters in a game that is faster playing, like what I would like is if you go to masterunitlist.gov.ca, I don't know what it is, whatever one, and then you print off the BattleTech unit cards. You can just print Alpha Strike cards. If you're going to play Alpha Strike, you just print off an 8.5 by 11 that's got like 6 units down the left-hand side, 6 units down the right-hand side. Put that beside the table. All of them are different mechs probably. And you just zigzag your boxes as you go along. Mm-hmm. Like, that is so good at using a roster, just like you're indicating. I don't see it working for a lot of other things, but if you're playing like a naval game or something where you have different vessel classes and it's easy to, or other games that do it are like, well, typically like vehicle games get away with this, right? Mm-hmm. Like you can have, talking about what a tanker, you'll have like a little dashboard that you print out and put little markers on for each vehicle in play. And that's how you indicate its status is on this. Like when I played it, I just put all those markers beside the vehicle because I didn't print out the dashboard. But that's the way you would conceivably do it is have a little dashboard that's provided on the website as a PDF that you print and you just put everything on that.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's funny because some of those dashboards, as you say, get fairly elaborate.
Oh, yeah.
Like some of them are like printable, like laser CNC cutout, like little wood panels with places to sink dice into. And
yeah,
there's some pretty wild stuff that comes up.
Yeah, there's really cool like template-y devices, right, that you could use to track things. Like they're for Chain of Command First Edition, there was a third-party company that made like a little piece of wood dial for tracking your force morale, and like a little ticking dial thing. And it was cool. It was nice to have. You just get a little laminated sheet with the second edition now, so it's less important to have a separate tracking tool for that per se. But still, that was still cool though. I don't know. I find that in terms of like the most essential tools, you need your tokens, and then you need your measuring tools. And I am someone who likes the small tape measurer, the palm-sized tape measurer.
Okay, yeah.
I know that like a pre-marked stick or tool widget, whatever you want to call it, is valuable and can be like good for fast play. But I would just much rather have a tape measurer that I slide out to 12 inches, click the little lock down, and then I can move it around and move my cavalry, whatever. I'm good. Like that's my preferred measuring approach on a tabletop. But if you're doing something like Dungeons and Dragons or many other more RPG or that style skirmish games, you might already be on a grid, and then you might have like arc tools. Do you know what I mean? That you would put down to show like what people can see from the grid, or like spell templates I've even seen. That's the thing. That's like more of a Pathfinder community thing, but
is that like templating? Is that sort of what you're...
Yeah, totally.
I don't know. I have mixed feelings. I think sometimes it just comes down to the quality of the template that you're using. Like a transparent template is definitely preferred.
Those are so much more expensive to make now. I don't know. I don't understand all the...
I don't know what it is. I when I was looking, it was pretty wild.
But it's crazy. Like the number of people who used to make third-party acrylic templates is not as much of a thing as it was even 5 years ago. And I don't know the reasons, the factors that have created that, but the number of people who have moved to like as cheap as they can cardboard, or instead premium MDF. He's kind of like split. You either went with like more expensive but higher quality wood components that you can't see through, or just as affordable a cardboard option as you can get. And that's kind of what I've seen most people do with their box sets, right? And I am someone who, I love a Warbase's MDF token. You know what I mean? It's crisp. It has that feel to it. They sometimes smell like laser wood. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
I know what you mean. That's a weird way of putting it, but I get it.
They'll have that smell forever, and it'll just be there. But I just really like those tokens, and I feel like they work really well. And even in some games, they'll make those tokens for the game as like a measuring tool. Like I'm thinking of Midgard, or how Legion does it with its plastic sticks.
Okay,
or
yeah.
the classic Song of Blade and Heroes, right? Doing it way back. And it's like, here's just a stick that's your measuring tool. And you don't have to do 6 inches. It's just small stick or medium stick.
One that I quite liked were the components, and I think this might be true of the World War II equivalent of it, but Warlord's Black Seas.
Oh, yeah.
In order to gauge the turning and angles based on the speed of the boat, because it's a game about masted ships, age of piracy, that kind of thing. And based on the setting of the speed on the boat, they have this cool little wheel thing that has a brake angle in it that basically, if you're going a certain speed, you can turn anywhere within this once you put it at the back of the boat. So it's kind of like, it looks like a wheel, but it has a little chunk taken out of it on both sides.
Oh, that's cool. Very cool.
One of them has a wider angle, and then the other one is a narrower angle. The other nice thing about it is they also provide a ruler for your standard measure, but it also has the angles done in a different way if you prefer to do that. So it was nice that it was accommodating, so that if you found this awkward or this made more sense, you have this thing where it's got like a cut angle on both ends that's more like a ruler, I guess. Usually when I think about transparent templates, I'm thinking of like blast templates.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And I don't even think those need to be transparent, because essentially if I put it over and I can't see the guy, then I must have hit him.
Yeah.
But there is something nice about having this, the ability to kind of see through it. That I don't know if it affects immersion or maybe a little, but there's this, there's a sense of it that makes it feel more or less cumbersome. But in the case of these rulers, putting them down on the table, because they're not interfering with the pieces, I love sailing ship style combat games, but the models are so fiddly because of the masts.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
So anything that doesn't touch those makes me feel better.
100%.
So the fact that like any of these hard cardboard measures, and I guess, would it be a protractor? But yeah, it's essentially for measuring the angle.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't interfere. In fact, it shows exactly from what angle you should be turning, which is from the rudder. So you put it at the back of the boat, and it doesn't clip or touch anything. It's great. But yeah, it kind of speaks to my idea about like what's too much, how far. I'm always concerned about clutter, I guess.
Well, that's kind of the thing. On a table, how far can you go before you are damaging the aesthetic quality of the play state? And we have to admit, if we're using fancy models, it's because it looks good, not because it is inherently more accurate to do so. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we don't want to lose the visual appeal of our game by putting down 14 markers that are all bright colors that all represent different states that we have to remember, right? I think that's a design failing if that's what's happening. So it's like, where's the threshold? It's different for every game, and even different scales of models, right? Like a game like a 28 mil game, I think you can have more tokens around because the guys are taller than the tokens. They're towering over them. Like there's a scale relationship to them.
Right.
But in some other games, if you have like a 6 mil game and your tokens are being placed like readily all over the place, they are as big as the actual models. So that has an impact on the state. Like the scaling is off sometimes with that. So we talked about Laserstorm a while ago. I really liked that game because it's small models and it avoids a lot of counters around them. So they maintain the visual focus on the table.
Yeah, 100%. And maybe one like example of where this makes more sense. What was that game where as you attack guys, it leaves gore on the table and that acts as a sort of
sludge. Yeah.
Sludge. Yeah. That's the one. That game is it takes that idea of having too many markers and it makes it part of the battlefield, which is really cool.
I love that.
That's a cool way of like bending the game's mechanics to make that less of an issue by incorporating the messiness of it into the game.
And then calling it gore to make it even more messy. Fans of sludge. Now, here's a question that's moving to a sort of a new topic. How do you feel in role-playing games and also in war games about the inclusion of physical decks or cards? Like if you had a spell deck or a random book of magical things and someone draws the card, like how do you feel about taking things that could be tables but making them cards and things like that?
Having quick reference is a huge help, especially if it's a game that has a lot of complexity to it. But it depends on how those cards are integrated, I think. That's my biggest concern, because I always have this fear of a war game being too rounded down into like a board game that happens to not have a board.
I can relate to that.
And that's not inherently a problem, because I like board games as well. And there isn't necessarily an inherent problem having, say, spell cards. But I always have this thing where I feel like it indicates that there's some kind of unnecessary streamlining that may have happened. And that may not be the case. Like it could literally just be the rules written out on a small card that's portioned by each spell. And I don't even mind the idea that, say, you use it and you have to turn it over. That's convenient. So I don't think I have any specific problem with it. I think sometimes it makes me feel that the game might be a little too mechanically driven. But I think that's more of just maybe a biased observation based on some games that I've played.
And that's a great answer. Thank you for your perspective. I'm going to say I like a random table with dice a lot more than a deck of cards. The main reason being that I can actually read it on a phone or in a book without having to get all these dang cards out and like put them on the table and make a mess. I can just look and be like, scroll through this list of 100 things. Great. And that's not 100 cards that I have to manage and put in sleeves if I want to, or whatever. So give me a list and dice. That's what I would prefer. But to continue on that point, a QRS, a quick reference sheet, the rules with summaries and things can be really valuable. So I don't mind having to reference a list and then roll a D100, but being able to look at like a double-sided piece of paper that maybe you laminated or something, it can be so valuable, especially in wargaming. I love David Brown rules, for they're just great. But they come with these like really high quality QRS sheets. You get like 2 double-sided pages, and they just come with this rule book, and they're so good. His rules are complicated, sure, and maybe that's necessitated to a degree, but they're so awesome, and the quality is there, and just being that forward about it, like, oh, and here you go, this is part of it. It's super cool from a perspective of someone who wants to engage with those games. Now, this is sort of more of a table management question. Do you use dice trays, or do you just throw them?
I definitely prefer a dice tray if I can handle it. I even found this really cool secondhand wooden bowl that perfectly holds 2 dice. I use it for role playing because I'm usually not rolling like more. It probably holds more like 4 dice.
Oh, yeah.
But it's just so nicely contained, and I've added felt to the bottom of it so it cushions the hit. I don't know. I'm not making a ton of noise, but it also makes a satisfying sound.
Yeah.
But in terms of war games, yeah, that's more of a practical matter in my opinion. Even if it's just the lid of a box, sometimes it can be hard to find something. And I've used those little foldy ones, the ones that are basically like faux leather with snaps.
Yeah.
And you know what? They work. They do the job. They've got perimeter, and they can keep the dice from scattering across the table. Sometimes I don't use them because I think one of the things I find with dice trays is because you have that contained space, sometimes you might want to save a roll. So, for instance, to use chain of command for an example, I tend to roll my chain dice out of the tray.
Me and Darren, we have a tower. We roll our chain dice in the tower and keep them there, so they are in there, and then the rest of it goes into like sort of a lid bin thing. It's sort of messy, but it works. But
that's a very specific case though, because like not that many war games that I can think of have like roll and keep as a mechanic. Well, roll and keep is, I'm actually misusing that terminology. That has more to do with like best of whatever number. But this is where the tray is probably the most useful, is if you're playing a game that uses like fistfuls of D6s or whatever.
I will agree with that, certainly.
If you're playing a game where you're only rolling like 2 dice for any particular action, it doesn't matter. As long as you're not knocking anything over and you're rolling in a sensible part of the table, it's not an issue. But if you're playing a game where you're just taking heaps and heaps of dice and then throwing them in, it's probably better to keep that wrangled.
Now, I want to move our topic on to the next important set of aids, because we've talked a lot about ways to manage like playing on the table, a lot about war games, some about RPGs. But now this will maybe relate more to role-playing games and some to wargaming, but campaign play. So long-form gaming. What type of aids are you going to use? And let's create a scenario. So Max, you're a game master, because that is often the case. If you're sitting down with a pair of gamers, or you got a quad of gamers here, and you're going to do, we'll say, an adventure, what do you feel is essential, and what do you feel is luxury, and what do you not even think about in terms of things that you would have as supporting materials or software or accoutrement to your GMing?
Oh, so we're talking RP?
I would say RP. It could extend to wargaming, because I feel like there's less of a difference than often is implied, but because in some types of wargaming campaigns at least. But let's talk role-playing first, because that is something that I think is more immediately familiar in the long-form campaign play.
Usually I do a combination of digital notes, which are pre-written. So I don't generally like to type in, because I find jotting things down, especially like temporary stuff or just things that I need to keep track of, is a little bit easier in a physical form. Plus, it makes me memorize it a bit better. I usually have, if not my laptop, then my tablet, which might have supplements, rule books. Try not to overload it. There's definitely a preference for having a physical core rule book as well. My best recommendation for tracking this, and this is a very specific thing, and maybe this is just for me, is a Hilroy steno book. Have you seen these?
No. What is the unique characteristic of this steno book?
One, it's the size of it. So it's about 15 by 22 centimeters a sheet. and it's lined paper that has a divider line right through the middle of it. And it's for essentially shorthand and then consequential breakdown. I actually use these for organizing my like day as well. Because what I'll do is I'll write out all of the things that I need to do that day. And then anything that comes up or as a result of either not finishing something or something new coming up, I write it in the column across from it. And then when I go to the next day, I move all the right-hand column things into the new left-hand column. But I do something similar for how I track things like damage and hit points and things on enemies by having this neatly divided column system, because no one column is really big enough to write more than, I don't know, a few lines across. It's enough that you could write out a little chunk there. It's really good for bullet points, but then dividing line makes it easy to distinguish that the thing across from it might be related to the thing that you wrote.
And this allows you to record what you were saying earlier is more your temporary information, stuff that will be recorded and maybe not referenced again as frequently, like the results or HP of a specific fight.
Yeah, so like anything that I'm doing that's essentially bookkeeping for the game, real time and such, it goes in the steno book. I might also include so I'll usually have the left column be for action results, initiative order, any kind of bonuses and when those happened. And on the right side, I will have that for more of like the consequences of things that will be passed on into later. Right. So if I'm playing a game where there's like critical injuries, then I'll be like, oh, so-and-so has a broken arm.
Yeah, yeah.
And also like narrative points that come up tend to go into the right column. And I just like the ability to it's funny because you were mentioning something else in how you split for your war games, your mechanical references from your narrative references. And I guess I kind of do the same thing, but I found this particular booklet that makes that clearer to me.
Yeah, what you point out is absolutely true about my gameplay style. Like when I'm doing a wargaming campaign, I tend to have explicit mechanical notes in like a notepad, typically digital, but then my narrative or my more, quote, historic notes are like not written in the context of any mechanics. They're written sort of mechanic free so that I can look back on them and not be like, wait, what the heck is a -3 doing in the middle of this? And, when I look back, it's more of a walk down memory lane than like a mechanical exercise, so to speak.
I think what anyone listening to this can take from this is that it's helpful to create separations between different sorts of notes.
Yeah, 100%.
You could divide it as much as like mechanical and narrative, depending on what you're doing. I tend to like to think of it as more like short and long-term memory for the game.
That makes sense too. That's another way to describe it.
I think that's more of an RPG focused thing because there's obviously consequences. Like I might write in the column that like this particular unit died or took so many hit points, but then I might also include in the column across from it that this faction is now mad at them because that guy died.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I can draw a line across from that to indicate why that's the case. And it can all be done in shorthand, effectively.
See, what I find is, say, for example, I'm playing a war game. I'll write in a notepad the army list because that army list is likely part of a living game. That will change. But in the notes, I'll reference it more narratively. So, for example, I might talk about 12 platoon in my notes. But if I look at my mechanical notes, that's 4 conscript squads. But say the designer's like, I don't like that. Maybe that's 4 militia squads now. It's like, there's no worry in my notes about whatever happens to that game because that's not even what I'm talking about anymore. I'm talking about the outcomes and how I've reflected on them. And that's the purpose of those notes. While the other notes are like a snapshot of rules in a moment as they relate to generating a dynamic outcome for this narrative campaign. Now, here's another question. When you're playing a campaign, and this applies to both role-playing and war games, pardon me, do you think you need like a master map, like an overarching map? Or can it exist? Like you can do theater of the mind for the bar fight, right? Where you're like knocking a guy with a tankard. But do you need a continental or regional map? Is that more essential somehow?
I think it depends on the sort of game you're running, and the scale of it. I do think it's useful to know where things are in relation to each other, and that usually works best on a map of some kind, or if not a map in the traditional sense, then like a mind map.
I was going to say a mind map actually is more what I have taken to use because I lack the direct artistic talents, we'll say, to put a pen to paper and develop a map. Even though there's a million tools out there that I could use, I tend to rely more on like relational distances than on like specific, like, and across this range of mountains is a river. And across, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, and I'm a more artistically inclined, and I actually enjoy the process of making maps, but sometimes I just don't have the time. And it might not even be incredibly necessary depending on like how long the game is intended to go or how much geography is going to play. It may literally just be relational. You know, there's a secret cult coven in the bottom of the tavern.
Yeah.
Right. And so I just need to have a box that says tavern and then a little like dotted line to indicate that it's not obvious. And then another box that says secret cult lair.
Yeah.
And that's the thing is I try to use common symbolism even in the flowchart that I'm using in order to keep track of it. Like, don't make a system more complicated than it needs to be, and make it meaningful as well. I think that's my best advice in that sense.
I get you exactly. It's the classic advice of don't over prep. No prep is wasted per se, but just don't over prep into the corner of madness where you've done so much work that you almost can't use it anymore because it's closed itself off. You've answered all the questions because you've written all the answers in yourself, you know?
And you probably didn't write down all the answers, and then all of that prep might go out the window because some player did something that you weren't expecting or engaged with the situation. Like, it's not a closed system.
No, that's true.
Well, especially RPGs. To some degree, war games can be a closed system, but even then, like once you introduce campaign, that becomes less clear.
See, I've played war game campaigns. Now, this is like outer space sci-fi, and it's worked quite well because there wasn't a map. And what worked was that there was no like deterministic, like, well, this is the route of ingress into your sector of space. I will go this way to get to you. It was like I didn't know. It just kind of narratively, when the narrative beats aligned with that moment, or they have not yet, in fact, in this living campaign, but when they will, it'll be dynamic in a way that I can't predict because I won't be able to look at a map and go, well, the only way past the asteroid belt's through the nebula. So I guess I'm taking the nebula. Like, you know what I mean? That isn't there to inform me already. I'll get to that even if that is the case or not. Maybe it is. Maybe that's satisfying for that beat once arrived at. But there's like a certain fog of war I like to maintain at times. Mind you, that's not really appropriate for like a Napoleonic countryside battle.
There's a situation where I guess it depends on the context of the fight, but you might not find it appropriate. You might find, or rather, you might find it more appropriate to know all of the area, and there won't be surprises, at least in that aspect.
In like a platoon level World War II game, like going map to map down a ladder, like in a At the Sharp End campaign or something like that, that's kind of cool because like the platoon, the members of the platoon don't all have like aerial photographs they're looking at, knowing exactly the ground they're fighting over. They're encountering that ground as they go. So there's a certain like lack of familiarity that they themselves will have as the assumed attacker going through unfamiliar terrain, thinking of the Allies in Normandy, right? They had aerial photography, of course, and and that went all the way down to different officer levels in the battalion. But if you're like a corporal in charge of a rifle section, you might not know how many rows of hedgery are in front of you. And you're discovering this on your approach. You're learning the extent of your tactical bounds through actual like physical reconnaissance and progress, right? It's interesting that you also don't necessarily need to provide a super detailed map. You could know like that's the town, then we're taking the church as the objective, and then behind the church is the airfield, which is the real base, right? And you may know those as key points or key landmarks on like in a mind map style node system, but you don't necessarily need to have like, here's the map of that town in advance, because thinking of who's going to be there, they probably didn't even have that themselves. A different setting might change that consideration, right? Or a different scale of command. You know what I'm saying? Like maybe if you're doing a battalion officer, like what I did for Darren when we were playing an O group game, is as I got my camera like way over top of the table and took a bird's eye view, and then I did it black and white filters and adjusted it all to make it look like a really beat up old aerial piece of photography. And I gave that to him over text before the game, thinking like, you're a battalion commander, you would have this, you know, and it kind of made sense to me to do that. But I don't know that in like a game where you're playing with just like a local platoon sergeant, would they have that? I don't know.
I mean, I guess it's dependent on the scenario.
Yeah, truly.
And I think we're almost drifting into like the logistics of like stealth mechanics and like generative tables. So, and by generative tables, I don't necessarily mean the tables that you roll dice and cross-reference. I mean like literally your table adding pieces while playing the game.
Yeah, that's right.
Not a common feature of war games, but definitely there are a few that have something like that.
When you're managing a campaign, do you use like the fancy, I'll call them fancy because I'm old school. I just use Google Docs and maybe an Excel or something on the side, but it's like a Word document is what I use. That's all I need. There are Trellos, Notions. There are World Anvil. These are like actual platforms that could give you a lot more information. There's even like writing tools that authors use that work. There's that one, I forget. People have used a variety of sources. I kind of feel if you just do headings in a Google document, you're most of the way there, unless what you're doing is overwhelmingly complex. And maybe it is. But for the most part, if you're doing a D&D game, I don't think you need a $99.99 annual World Anvil subscription. Like you can get that out of a Google Doc if you just type it in.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to just use either Google Docs. For some war games, I might make something in Excel because it is more sort of like tracking units or custom units and things like that.
It's list friendly, numeric friendly, right?
Yeah, it leans more to that than, say, something that has the more of a written narrative form.
I insert tables a lot of times into a doc to be able to kind of like proxy in a micro spreadsheet, but like, yes, I know what you mean. Like actually using spreadsheets can be really valuable.
I think it depends on how numerically focused the game is, because I sometimes feel constrained by that aspect of things. But then I'm also then there's another factor. Am I working from like this is in the RPG sense, though it could apply if you were playing certain war games with scenarios. But if I'm running a pre-written adventure, what I've probably done is unpacked some part of that. So I've written down what I think are the most important things. This is especially, I recommend this especially if you're running a mystery.
Oh, yeah.
So this could be Call of Cthulhu, or there's certain Warhammer Fantasy roleplay scenarios that work that way, or Delta Green, or anything like that. Often the information given to you in the scenario is, one, more than you actually need to know. Like you might need to know it, but more than you actually need to reference. And it's often not laid out in a way that you might use it. It may be more for the purposes of reading it from a book than necessarily running that in person or in a live situation. Things that I like to definitely have are the stats of any creature or combatant, including generic ones that I might need to throw out at any given time.
Oh, like would you call it like random encounter guys or filler guys in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, it could be part of a random encounter. I might even include a random encounter table there, but it's just important for me to have all the notable characters plus some generics on another page. Again, it depends on what you're running. And like, for instance, aside from like Delta Green is an interesting one because you probably only need the things that are specifically stated because it is a very realistic setting. But I guess having something like different statted out authorities, or maybe even just a generic person stat template would be useful. But in games that use like monsters that you could run into, like, I don't know how to say, like non-cosmically destroying, mind-melting things that you may only encounter one of in a game, and you are not expected to fight it in the normal sense. Yeah, it's probably good to have a handful of those ready. If I'm doing it live, I often have a GM screen.
Those are so valuable for physical play as a game master. I can't stress enough.
For more than that, I recommend getting one that you can remove the sheets from.
Oh, those are so cool.
Not only is it cool because you can customize like the look of it, but also you can tailor, if you have the patience to do this, and some people have done it for you if you look around. I don't know why this is, but some producers of some role-playing games don't put things into their screens that I would actually find useful.
I know what you're talking about. Don't you want a list of 100 names taking up 40% of one of your screens?
So that's why I have usually a binder of quick reference sheets that are essentially extra stuff that I wouldn't need to, like, I want to know how to adjust difficulty, or like, what the general reference to this, or the combat procedure, so that I know that I can follow it. And like, I should know what that is anyway, but it's nice to just see it there and be able to kind of go through it.
Mm-hmm.
That is another thing that I usually take to a table, especially in person. It would be digital if I was doing it over chat or a VTT or something like that, or it might be in the VTT. But I usually have a slim binder of quick reference. These could be things like travel procedures.
Oh, yeah.
If games have that, random encounters, downtime activities, if that's a thing. It might contain some information about the world, but it's essentially more mechanical stuff that it's like an extension to my screen. I'd only need it in a certain situation. And I'm the sort of person that will customize and organize these myself. So I'll make sure that everything I need for this situation is on this 1 or 2 pages, and they're like right across from each other. One of my problems with some games is that, like, even with the rules, like as I said, with the adventure, it's not always laid out in the way that would be usable. And I find rule books also work that way. I actually like how wargame rule books tend to have like quick references and stuff at the back. Some role-playing games have that, but yeah. Actually, I want to sort of put a question to you. So what's your take on like digital tools? Because we've already talked about like using Google Docs and stuff like that, but what about like specifically made digital tools?
There are like interesting ones that exist. I don't really get into the specific like VTT space because I am a theater of the mind role player, right? So those specific apps aren't really what I'm looking for. I like Hexographer because that is cool. And you can like make useful supplemental things, but you're not like in it as a way to interface with your players. Like, we played a really cool DCC campaign. I've referenced it before, but it was in a VTT. And it meant that there were like perceptive limits to what you could almost do or express because of the platform we were in. It was really cool because we got to drag our counter around on this giant map, so it felt like we were almost exploring in a video game in a way. So that was really cool, and kind of was like, it's one of the things you can win out of a VTT. It's like, oh, we're playing a homemade video game. This is sick. So that was cool. However, it did put a lot of artifice onto the role-playing game that then you're all of a sudden pressing big buttons again, And it's like, we have described many times that it's not the intent behind a lot of our role-playing experiences. We want to be like describing the action through the action itself, not through a bunch of mechanized statements,
Yeah. I mean, that said, I do like using some kind of markers for relational reference, because not everybody is a visually imaginative person. And having something that, at least say in a fight, like, you don't have to like I'm usually against mapping out the whole dungeon. I prefer, it's cooler if like a player does that because one, they could get it wrong and that's entertaining. But two, it adds a level of verisimilitude by them having to do that. Depends on the person. Some people aren't into that. But I do find it useful to have little things on the table so that you can say, well, there's a piece of cover here, and like more like a battle mat.
Yes, I can see the value of those. I've played a lot of games with different individuals who've really gotten a lot more out of it, and you can really feel someone's level of engagement change. Like you're playing with someone, and they might just be like, "I attack because I don't see what's happening." But then you put down like a couple cubes on a table, or you draw some rectangles in an image and post it into a group chat, and then they're like, "I'm behind the left rectangle doing this." And then all of a sudden they're bought in. And that's something that's true because you must think of the buy-in, and all these tools are there to help with that. They're not going to make the game work better, they will make the game work better, but they won't make the game inherently better, just its operation. So once you're using these tools effectively, then it's a better experience and the players can get on board with it. And I think stuff like maps and things can really help with that. I try and avoid them on the sheer principle of the effort involved and my personal lack of aptitude at drawing them up. But when it comes to a theater of the mind type of fight, I tend to really think of it in terms of like zones of description, like where you got a little bit of marsh and right beside that's the road, and just behind the marsh is the graveyard. And I try and leave it at that. And then we'll talk about like, I'm in the graveyard. I want to hide behind a gravestone. And it's like, sure you can. There's a lot of those. I'm not going to worry about that. But it's like, that's how I've handled it without using gameplay aids, for example. But even just being at a laptop or a tablet where a phone could do it too, where you draw out like shapes onto a blank image and then use that as a way to convey the layout of a space, room, or even a simple dungeon. That could really work and be a simple tool to get everyone in the room, whether digital or otherwise, like on the same page. And I think ultimately that's what your tools got to do, is they just got to tie everyone down like to that same page where when I look at your squad, I can see how effed up they are from my last round of shooting because your tokens are communicating something to me. Right? And I'm on the page that you're on because we can both look at these aids to tie us there. It's not like I have to recall, like, I did pretty good. You have how many points of damage? It's like you have 6 points of damage. There's a die or 2, 3 tokens. You know what I'm saying? There's ways to track that. And that's what these aids are meant to do, right? Like keep us moving so we don't get stuck having to go back to the core book and flip to page 47 and know what the laser does again,
That's the main point of it. And the other thing that I would say that is an important thing to keep in mind is be mindful of how what you add to the game changes how you play it. My best example for this is I'm also more of a theater of the mind, though I tend to respect the need for tactical representation. So I will describe it, but I might also have a relational thing. What I don't use are miniatures because I don't want you to think of your character as the thing on the table, which is an automatic association. I want you to think of the character in your head, and that thing on the table is it's a blip, right? It's a relative marker that is purely for the sake of the tactical interaction that's happening. I don't want the player to put their mind's eye through the thing happening at the table. I'm not saying that's a bad way to play, but it's a different game when you're doing it that way. There's some people that model out like the whole dungeon and they use dungeon tiles and all this other stuff. And that's probably fine, but it does have a different feeling of play than, especially if I'm doing something that like I tend to go to more intrigue and mystery. And I do like running DCC, and I actually tend to run it more like a classic dungeon crawler where I'm mapping, like, as I said, the one that we were playing. I don't think I would run Call of Cthulhu like that, but I might give people a notion of, say, like a gunfight broke out in a room where everybody was and what they could hide behind, but not only key features, right? And I would announce those key features as well. right? Like I would say that there's this, and that would be the first thing I say. And then I would either reveal or quickly sketch that out. Because I do think there's something inherently useful about, again, it really depends on how tactical you're playing. If you're playing a looser game where it's like, oh, well, I just describe whether I sidestep or any of these other things, not that important. But if positioning, especially cooperative positioning, matters, then I really think you kind of need to show it somehow. But I think it's important to be mindful of how much is leaning on these aids and where the focus of it is. I mean, we should do an episode about theater of the mind.
That'd be very fun to do.
Because I think that's a very different way of running a game just generally.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that everybody knows how to do that. Like, obviously, I'll save the argument for this because I'll have to think it out a bit more. But it's not just the GMing it, but also players understanding the play style of that, which short answer is ask a lot of questions.
I was going to say, be a detective. It's all about the questions.
Yeah, like you won't know if something's there unless you ask.
Yeah, I can't exhaustively describe an environment to you perfectly. You have to meet me with like interpretation of what the space could contain and then ask cool questions about it. And then we're going.
That's leaning way more into the style that is away from player aids. So to tie it back to what we're talking about.
That's true. I think what you're looking to do is it's like just the player aids are another way to communicate. And sometimes it's the rules and you communicating more efficiently through like a QRS or a reference. But other times it's you and the other player communicating through shared information like broken status with a red explosion marker next to your dudes. Like, you know what I mean? So it's just about like making that communication more efficient. And when you start to lose that efficiency due to over cluttering or over obsessive note taking or all these things, like you're losing the point of what the aid is meant to do. It's meant to make the communication better.
Yeah, agreed. That'll cover it, I suppose. I mean, we could go on and on.
No, I think you're right. I think that's a good way to look at that. And game aids show up in basically all of our games. But next week, we're going to pivot to look at a specific game and not just one game. I want to hear Max give me his rundown on this.
So I've referenced it long enough, and I know that one of our first episodes was the first edition of this game. But I'm going to do a compare and contrast between Warhammer Fantasy Role-Playing 2nd and 4th edition. Because, I mean, I'll get into it in the episode, but they are a conversation happening. And they both have strengths and weaknesses that I think are interesting to explore.
I absolutely look forward to diving in on that. There's ones we've both played, both editions, so it'll be very cool to get deeper in on that. So thanks again for everyone listening in, and happy gaming.
Happy gaming.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.